Noticing her mare's sudden and unusual labor, the old woman's suspicion flared. With trembling hands, the old woman reviewed the barn's security footage, one that made her blood run cold. "No, this can't be," she whispered, her chest tightening with dread. Goldie reared back, her hooves slamming against the stall's wooden wall with a deafening crack. Charlotte flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, she inched closer, her hand outstretched. "Easy, girl. Easy," she whispered, her voice trembling but soft. The mare's wild eyes locked onto her for a fleeting second before Goldie thrashed again. Charlotte stepped forward instinctively, and that's when it happened. A sharp jolt of pain shot through her arm as Goldie's hoof clipped her wrist. Charlotte stumbled back, clutching her hand, her breath caught in her throat. "Damn it!" she hissed, glancing down. Blood trickled from a small but deep gash near her wrist. "Goldie, stop it!" Charlotte's voice cracked as she darted forward, barely dodging a splintered plank of wood the mare had kicked loose. The stallion's hooves pounded against the floor, each strike echoing through the barn like a gunshot. Goldie reared up, her eyes wild and rolling, the whites flashing as she let out another piercing scream. Charlotte clutched the edge of the door, unsure whether to approach or retreat. This wasn't normal. Goldie was usually calm, a steady, dependable mare. But now she looked like a trapped animal, her drenched coat glistening under the dim light. The mare stomped again, sending her feeding trough skittering across the barn, the sound of its metal scraping against the concrete, making Charlotte wince. "Something's wrong," Charlotte muttered, fumbling for her phone. Her hands shook as she dialed. The moment Dr. Miller picked up, she didn't wait for pleasantries. "Doctor, you need to get here now. Goldie's going crazy. She's tearing the place apart." "Calm down, Mrs. Kastner." His voice was steady but urgent. "Is she injured? Can you see any blood?" "No, it's not that." Charlotte pressed her palm against her forehead, trying to make sense of the chaos. "She's in pain, but there's no reason. She hasn't been near any other horse. I don't understand what's happening." "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Stay with her, but don't get too close." The call ended, leaving Charlotte with nothing but the sound of Goldie's ragged breathing and the sharp clatter of hooves on the stall floor. She gritted her teeth and stepped closer, holding her hands out in a gesture of reassurance. "It's okay, girl. It's okay." Her voice trembled as much as her hands. Goldie snorted, flaring her nostrils, and slammed her body against the side of the stall. The whole structure shook, dust cascading from the rafters. Charlotte stumbled back, fear coiling tight in her stomach. Dr. Miller arrived faster than she'd expected, pulling up in his mud-splattered truck. His weathered face was set in a grim line as he hurried into the barn, a bag slung over his shoulder. "She's over there," Charlotte said, gesturing with a shaky hand. "I don't know what's gotten into her, Doctor. She's not herself." Dr. Miller nodded and approached Goldie with practiced calm. The mare's ears twitched toward him, her movements still frantic, but slightly less erratic. He spoke softly, his words a soothing hum that even Charlotte couldn't quite catch. Slowly, he extended a hand to touch Goldie's neck. The mare flinched, but didn't bolt. "She's in distress," Dr. Miller muttered, running his hands along Goldie's body, checking her limbs, her pulse. His movements were deliberate, clinical, but when he pressed gently against her swollen belly, his face darkened. "Mrs. Kastner," he said, his voice low but sharp, "I think Goldie's in labor." Charlotte blinked, the words not making sense at first. "Labor? That's not possible." "I'm telling you what I'm seeing." He looked up, his gaze steady but grim. "She's showing all the signs." "No, you don't understand," Charlotte said, stepping closer, her voice rising. "Goldie hasn't been near a stallion, not once. She hasn't left this property in over a year." Dr. Miller didn't argue. He simply gestured to Goldie's heaving sides. "Then you explain why her belly's contracting like that, or why she's acting like this. Ma'am, your mare's about to foal." Charlotte opened her mouth to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She'd noticed Goldie's belly getting larger over the past months, but she'd chalked it up to bloating, a minor digestive issue, nothing serious. But now, a piercing cry from Goldie snapped her out of her thoughts. The mare buckled, her legs trembling as she sank to the floor. Dr. Miller sprang into action, rolling up his sleeves and barking orders. "Keep her calm, Mrs. Kastner. Talk to her. Hold her steady if you can." Charlotte hesitated, then crouched beside Goldie's head. The mare's eyes were wide, filled with something raw and unnameable. Charlotte reached out, resting a hand on Goldie's damp neck. "It's okay, girl. I'm here," Charlotte murmured, her voice shaky but steady enough to cut through the chaos. Blood trickled steadily from her wrist, but she pressed it against her hip, ignoring the sting. Goldie's heaving breaths filled the barn, each exhale a desperate rasp that made Charlotte's chest tighten. "Mrs. Kastner, I need you to keep talking to her," Dr. Miller said sharply, his sleeves already rolled up as he crouched behind Goldie. "She's in serious distress. We need her to calm down or this could go sideways fast." Charlotte nodded, swallowing hard as she leaned closer to the mare. Goldie flinched at first, her ears flattening against her head, but Charlotte didn't back away. "You've got this, sweetheart," she whispered. Her fingers trembled as they smoothed over Goldie's neck. "You're the strongest girl I know. Just a little more." Dr. Miller's hands worked methodically, his face lined with concentration. "The foal's positioned wrong," he muttered, mostly to himself. "It's going to take time." The barn was thick with tension, the kind that pressed down on your chest and made it hard to breathe. Charlotte barely noticed the blood soaking through her sleeve. She could feel the warmth seeping into the fabric, but all she cared about was the mare lying before her. Minutes passed like hours. Then Dr. Miller straightened abruptly. "I've got it!" he exclaimed. With a firm, practiced pull, he guided the foal free. The wet, shivering colt slipped onto the straw, his tiny legs kicking instinctively. "It's a boy," Dr. Miller said, relief softening his voice. He grabbed a towel and began cleaning the foal, rubbing vigorously to stimulate its breathing. Charlotte let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "Oh, Goldie," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. She pressed her forehead to the mare's neck, feeling the rise and fall of her labored breathing. "You did it, girl. You did it." Goldie's ears twitched, a faint acknowledgement, but she didn't relax. Charlotte frowned, her gut twisting with unease. The mare's sides were still heaving, her muscles tightening as if bracing for another wave of pain. "Doctor?" Charlotte's voice wavered. "Why is she still—" Dr. Miller froze mid-motion, his hands hovering over the foal. His eyes darted to Goldie's abdomen and his expression shifted from relief to alarm. "No," he whispered, almost as if he didn't believe it himself. "That can't be." "What?" Charlotte's voice sharpened with panic. "What can't be?" "She's still contracting." Dr. Miller moved back to Goldie's side, his hands pressing gently against her swollen belly. His jaw tightened as he muttered, "There's another one." Charlotte blinked, the words not registering at first. "Another what?" "Another foal." He looked at her, his face pale with disbelief. "She's having twins." The words hit Charlotte like a punch to the chest. "No," she said, shaking her head. "That's not possible. Horses don't—" Her voice broke off as Goldie let out a gut-wrenching cry, her body convulsing violently. "Mrs. Kastner, I need you to focus, Dr. Miller barked, his calm demeanor cracking under the weight of the moment. Twins in horses are almost unheard of, and it's dangerous. She's going to need our help to get through this. Charlotte didn't hesitate. Despite the throbbing pain in her arm, she pressed both hands against Goldie's neck, whispering soothing words. You're not done yet, girl. I know you've got more fight in you. Goldie's body bucked, her legs kicking out weakly as another contraction racked her frame. Dr. Miller worked quickly, his hands steady but his expression tense. This isn't going to be easy, he muttered. The second foal's smaller, might be weaker. Charlotte's stomach churned, but she refused to let fear take over. You hear that, Goldie? She said, her voice fierce. That baby needs you. You don't quit now, you hear me? The mare's ears flicked again, and for a brief moment, Charlotte swore she saw a flicker of determination in those tired, wild eyes. The minutes dragged on, every second punctuated by Goldie's labored cries and the sharp commands from Dr. Miller. Then, finally, a new sound cut through the tension. A faint, high-pitched whinny. Dr. Miller pulled back, cradling a tiny, trembling foal in his hands. It's a girl, he said, his voice soft with awe. He quickly began rubbing the second foal, coaxing it to breathe. Charlotte stared, her breath catching in her throat. The little filly was smaller than her brother, her movements sluggish but determined. She's alive, Dr. Miller said almost to himself. He looked up at Charlotte, his eyes wide. I've never seen anything like this. Twins, both alive. It's a miracle. Charlotte reached out with trembling hands, her bloodied sleeve forgotten as she touched the filly's damp coat. Dr. Miller crouched by the exhausted mare, his eyes shifting between the two newborn foals nestled beside Goldie. The air in the barn felt heavier now, as though even the walls understood the weight of what had just transpired. He wiped his hands on a towel, his face a mix of disbelief and awe. Charlotte looked up from where she sat, still cradling Goldie's head. What do you mean, Doctor? Her voice was hoarse, a mixture of exhaustion and lingering worry. Dr. Miller gestured toward the foals. Twins in horses are almost unheard of, and when they do happen, it's rarely a happy ending. Horses' bodies aren't designed to carry two foals to term. Most of the time, the embryos compete for resources. One is usually absorbed by the other early in the pregnancy, or worse, both fail to survive. It's nature's way of protecting the mother. Charlotte's brow furrowed as she processed his words. But Goldie, she carried both of them. And her voice caught, and she glanced down at the mare. Goldie's sides rose and fell in deep, even breaths, the exhaustion plain, but no longer desperate. Dr. Miller nodded, his tone growing more serious. That's the part I can't explain. Carrying twins this far is nearly impossible without complications. Most mares would require intervention. Usually, one of the embryos has to be terminated to ensure the survival of the other and the mother. But Goldie, she did it all on her own, without any of us knowing. Charlotte shook her head slowly, her fingers brushing over the damp mane of her beloved mare. She's stronger than I ever gave her credit for, she murmured. Dr. Miller continued, even the delivery was a miracle. The positioning, the risk of one foal blocking the birth canal or injuring Goldie. Any number of things could have gone wrong tonight. Yet here we are, with two healthy foals and a mother that pulled through. Charlotte's eyes brimmed with tears as she turned her gaze to the two foals. Will had already started wriggling closer to Goldie's side, nuzzling her for comfort, while Grace lay quietly, her small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Despite her frail size, There was a tenacity in her every movement. The doctor's voice softened. "You don't just have foals here, Mrs. Kastner. You've got something extraordinary. These two defied the odds. And your Goldie, she gave everything to make sure they had a chance. I've never seen anything like this in my entire career." Charlotte nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Her emotions felt too big, too overwhelming to fit into words. Finally, she whispered, "Grace." Dr. Miller raised an eyebrow. "Grace? That's her name," Charlotte said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Because that's what she is, a gift, a miracle, just like her brother." She reached out, brushing her uninjured hand gently against Grace's tiny frame. The foal stirred slightly under her touch, her fragile body warm and alive. Dr. Miller smiled faintly, his weathered face softening. "Grace, it's perfect." Charlotte leaned back, resting her head against the stall wall, her body aching, but her heart full. The barn fell quiet again, save for the occasional soft snuffle from the foals and the rhythmic breathing of their mother. "You need to take care of yourself too," Dr. Miller added, nodding toward her bloodied wrist. "That looks like it could use some stitching." She glanced down at the makeshift bandage she'd wrapped around her wrist hours ago. The pain was there, sharp and insistent, but she waved it off. "I'll take care of it later. Goldie and the babies come first." Dr. Miller hesitated, but didn't press further. He knew better than to argue with Charlotte when her mind was set. "They'll need rest, and so will you," he said, stepping out into the night. "Call me if there's any trouble." Charlotte nodded, her focus already drifting back to the stall. It was well past midnight by the time Charlotte finally left the barn. Her wrist throbbed, and her legs felt like lead, but she forced herself to climb the porch steps and push open the door to the house. The faint glow of a lamp illuminated the living room, and there, sitting on the couch with his head in his hands, was Charles. "You're back," he said without looking up. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Of course I'm back," Charlotte replied, her tone sharper than she intended. "Where else would I be?" Charles raised his head, his eyes meeting hers. "I mean, you've been out there for hours. I just thought—" He trailed off, standing slowly. "How's Goldie?" "She's fine," Charlotte said curtly, walking past him toward the kitchen. "And the foals are healthy. Dr. Miller called it a miracle." Charles followed, his footsteps heavy on the hardwood floor. "That's good. That's really good." Charlotte busied herself at the sink, rinsing her wrist under cool water. The sting brought tears to her eyes, but she blinked them away. "It doesn't make sense, though," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "What doesn't?" "How this happened?" She turned to face him, her gaze piercing. "How did Goldie get pregnant, Charles? We don't have a stallion, and she's never left this farm." Charles's face stiffened, but he forced a shrug. "I don't know. Maybe. Maybe someone snuck onto the property. These things happen, Charlotte." Her eyes narrowed. "Do they? Because I can't think of a single reason why someone would risk trespassing just to—" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "No, something doesn't add up." Charles opened his mouth as if to respond, but then he closed it again, his expression unreadable. "Maybe you're overthinking this," he said quietly. "The important thing is that they're safe, right?" Charlotte didn't answer. Instead, she brushed past him, heading for the medicine cabinet to retrieve gauze and antiseptic. As she wrapped her wrist, her thoughts churned. Overthinking? Maybe. But the unease gnawed at her, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story than she realized. By morning, Charlotte was back in the barn, checking on Goldie and the foals. Matthew had joined her, his excitement palpable as he crouched beside the stall. "Mom, look at them," he said, his grin wide. "They're perfect." "They are," Charlotte agreed, her voice softening. Will was already standing on wobbly legs, his curiosity evident as he nudged Grace, who was still curled up in the straw. The sight brought a fleeting warmth to her chest, but the questions lingered, shadowing her relief. As she stroked Goldie's mane, her eyes drifted to the camera mounted near the barn's entrance. It had been installed months ago, mostly as a precaution against coyotes, but now it felt like a lifeline, a way to uncover the truth. Later that afternoon, when the house was quiet and Matthew was helping Charles repair the fence, Charlotte sat at her computer, scrolling through the camera's footage. The grainy videos blurred together, daylight fading into night, the barn bathed in shadows. Then, just as she was about to give up, something caught her eye. A figure, hooded, moving with deliberate care. Charlotte leaned closer, her heart pounding as she watched the figure lead a horse into the barn. Storm. She recognized the horse instantly, Philip's prized stallion. Her breath caught as the figure unlatched Goldie's stall, guiding Storm inside before slipping away into the darkness. The footage ended abruptly, leaving Charlotte staring at the screen, her mind racing. Philip. It had to be. Who else had access to Storm? But why? And how had she not noticed anything amiss until now? Her chest tightened as anger flared. She needed answers, and she needed them now. Charlotte closed the laptop with a sharp snap, her pulse racing. The blurry figure on the footage haunted her thoughts. Someone had snuck onto her property in the dead of night and tampered with her animals, her family. She didn't have time to stew over it. Pulling on her boots, Charlotte grabbed her coat and headed outside. The sharp air bit at her skin, but she barely noticed. Her target was clear: Philip's farm. When she arrived, Philip was in the front yard, repairing the fence that bordered his paddock. He looked up as she pulled in, his face lighting up in a friendly smile that instantly irritated her. "Charlotte, didn't expect you this morning," he said, brushing off his hands as she climbed out of the truck. "What brings you by?" Charlotte wasted no time. "I need to talk to you about Storm." Philip's brow furrowed. "Storm? What about him?" "So he was on my property," Charlotte said, her voice tight. 2 months ago. I've got it on camera. Someone brought him to my barn, into Goldie's stall." Philip's face shifted, confusion giving way to offense. "That's ridiculous. Storm's never left my sight, and I sure as hell didn't bring him to your place. Why would I?" "That's what I want to know," Charlotte snapped. "Do you have any idea what this has done to us? Goldie almost—" Her voice broke, and she shook her head, trying to keep her composure. "She gave birth to twins last night, Philip. Twins. Do you know how rare and dangerous that is for a horse?" Philip held up his hands, palms outward. "Charlotte, I'm sorry about Goldie, truly. But I didn't do this. Storm's been here the whole time. Ask anyone. I've got no reason to mess with your animals." Charlotte stared at him, her breath shallow. "You're telling me you had nothing to do with this?" "Not a damn thing," Philip said firmly. "I was at a dinner party the night you're talking about. You can call them yourself if you don't believe me." Her stomach sank. If it wasn't Philip, then who? The footage was clear. It was Storm in the video. But Philip wasn't lying. She could see it in his face. She turned without another word, her mind racing as she climbed back into her truck. By the time she returned home, Charlotte's unease had only deepened. Back at the barn, she found Matthew and Charles tending to the foals. Grace wobbled on unsteady legs, leaning into Charles as he guided her toward a shallow trough of water. Will pranced nearby, full of the vigor of a newborn. "Mom, look at Grace," Matthew called, grinning. "She's getting stronger." Charlotte forced a smile, but her mind was elsewhere. That evening, Charlotte returned to the footage. She replayed the clip, focusing on the figure's movements. The gait was uneven, the right leg slightly slower than the left. Her breath hitched. It was too familiar, too distinct. Her hands trembled as she clicked through other clips, her mind racing, if her suspicion was right. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It can't be him." But doubt had already planted its seed, and it grew with each passing second. Charlotte pushed back from the desk and headed straight for Charles's workshop, her footsteps heavy with a mix of dread and determination. Inside, the familiar scent of oil and wood filled the small space. Her eyes scanned the cluttered room, lingering on the shelves crammed with tools and boxes. Her hand trembled as she pulled open the nearest drawer. At first, there was nothing unusual, just wrenches, screws, and old receipts. But then, in the next drawer, she found them. A pair of worn gloves lay crumpled at the bottom, the fabric stained with dried grass and flecks of mud. She picked them up slowly, her fingers brushing over the grime. Her stomach churned. Clutching the gloves, she turned to the coat rack by the door. Charles's old barn jacket hung there, the one he wore on chilly mornings. She rifled through the pockets, her pulse quickening. Her fingers grazed something metallic. Pulling it out, she stared at the object in her palm. A key, smudged with dirt. Charlotte gritted her teeth, anger rising like bile in her throat. She knew this key. It was the spare for the barn, the one that had gone missing months ago. Her gaze locked on the stack of papers she'd just uncovered. The faded logo of a local casino was stamped on the topmost receipt, along with an amount that made her stomach churn. Beneath it were several IOUs, hastily scrawled, and each one a damning piece of evidence. The weight of what she'd found pressed heavily on her chest. He wasn't just in debt, he was drowning in it. She clenched the papers in her hand, her jaw tightening as she stormed back toward the house. The gloves, the key, and now this. It was undeniable. Confrontation couldn't wait. Charlotte stormed into the kitchen where Charles sat, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked up, startled, as she threw the gloves and key onto the table between them. "Care to explain this?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fury. Charles blinked, his brow furrowing. "Charlotte, what?" "You lied to me," she said, her voice low and trembling with anger. Charles set the mug down, his brow furrowing. "Charlotte, I don't know what you're talking about." He glanced at the receipts and the IOUs, his face blanching. "I can explain." "Oh, I'm sure you can," Charlotte said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Explain how you got so deep into debt you thought risking Goldie's life was a good idea. Explain why you didn't come to me, why you had to sneak around like a thief in the night." "I did it for us," Charles shouted, rising to his feet. "For this family. You think I wanted this? You think I enjoyed having to make that choice?" Charlotte's laugh was bitter and sharp. "For this family. Don't make me laugh, Charles. You didn't think about this family. You didn't think about me or Goldie or those foals. You thought about yourself, about saving your own skin." His face darkened, his hands clenching at his sides. "And what about you, Charlotte? You've been so wrapped up in that damn horse, you don't even see what's happening around you. Do you even care about this family? Or is Goldie the only thing that matters to you?" Charlotte's breath caught in her throat, but her resolve didn't falter. "Don't you dare turn this around on me," she said, her voice icy. You think I care about Goldie more than this family? Let me tell you something, Charles. Goldie is part of this family. She's been there through everything, every hard season, every setback. She's never lied to me, never betrayed me. She gives everything she has without expecting anything in return. Can you say the same? Charles opened his mouth, but no words came out. Charlotte pressed on, her voice cracking with emotion. I fought for her last night, Charles. I bled for her. She gave birth to 2 miracles, and you almost took that from her. For what? To cover your gambling debts? To clean up your mess? You risked her life and theirs, and now you want to stand here and blame me. Charles lowered his gaze, his shoulders sagging. I didn't mean for it to go this far, he said quietly. I thought if the foals sold for enough, it could fix everything. I could fix everything. You can't fix this, Charlotte said, her voice softer but no less firm. Not with money, not with excuses. You broke my trust, Charles. And worse, you broke my heart. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned away, clutching the edge of the counter as she steadied herself. When she finally spoke, her words were calm and measured, but they carried the weight of finality. You need to leave, she said. I can't have you here right now, not after what you've done. Charlotte, please, he said, his voice pleading. This is my home too. Not anymore, she replied, turning to face him. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. Goldie and those foals, this family, deserve better than this. Charles stared at her, his face a mixture of anger, guilt, and desperation. But he must have seen the resolve in her eyes, because he didn't argue. Instead, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. He paused briefly, as if waiting for her to call him back. But when the silence stretched on, he opened the door and stepped outside. Charlotte rubbed her hands together, the early morning chill biting at her skin. The barn smelled of fresh straw and the faint, sweet musk of Goldie. Will pranced in the corner, his legs long and wobbly, but brimming with energy. Grace lay beside her mother, her small frame rising and falling with each shallow breath. Morning, girl, Charlotte whispered, kneeling beside Goldie and running her hand over the mare's soft coat. Grace stirred slightly at the sound of her voice, lifting her head just enough to nuzzle Goldie's side before settling back down. Dr. Miller arrived a short while later, his well-worn medical bag swinging at his side. He crouched beside Grace, his practiced hands moving over her frail legs. She's improving, he said with a nod. Slow but steady. You've been doing a good job with the supplements. Charlotte smiled faintly, her eyes never leaving Grace. It's her spirit, not mine. She's fighting so hard. Spirit helps, Dr. Miller agreed, standing and brushing straw from his knees, but so does care. Keep up with the leg massages, and she'll get there. The next few weeks blurred into a steady rhythm of work and care. Grace required constant attention. Her feeding schedule was strict, and Charlotte spent hours massaging the filly's legs as Dr. Miller had instructed. Will, by contrast, was a whirlwind of energy, darting around the stall and poking his nose into everything. It was exhausting, but every tiny improvement in Grace felt like a victory. The first time she stood without wobbling, Charlotte cried, silent tears that spilled over as she held the filly close. When Matthew joined her in the barn one afternoon, Charlotte was replacing a loose hinge on one of the stall doors. He watched her work for a moment before asking, "Mum, do you think they'll be safe now?" Charlotte paused, her hand tightening on the wrench. "I hope so," she said, "but we're not taking any chances." Together, they finished installing the last of the security upgrades. The barn now boasted reinforced doors and a state-of-the-art camera system, all linked to a monitor in the house. "We won't let anyone hurt them again," Charlotte said firmly, her gaze lingering on Will and Grace. "Not while I'm here." The changes weren't just physical. The barn buzzed with new life. Will and Grace grew more confident by the day, their playful antics a source of endless joy. Grace, though smaller, had a spark that couldn't be ignored. She chased her brother around the stall, her legs still a little shaky, but growing stronger. Charlotte often sat and watched them, a cup of coffee in hand. She smiled through tears when Will nudged Grace forward, encouraging her to take a few more steps. "You're just like your mama," she murmured to Grace. "Tough as nails." The story of Goldie's twins spread beyond the small town. A neighbor posted a video of Grace's first steps on social media, and soon messages from strangers poured in. People from all over shared their admiration for the mare and her foals, calling them miracles. Charlotte was overwhelmed by the attention, but deep down it felt good to know that Goldie's strength was inspiring others. The house was quiet without Charles. Too quiet some days. But Charlotte found solace in the steady hum of the barn, the rhythm of caring for her animals. She threw herself into her work, fixing fences, hauling feed, and tending to Goldie and the foals. One evening, as she brushed Grace's coat, Philip appeared at the barn door. "Need a hand?" he asked, holding up a bag of oats. Charlotte hesitated, then nodded. "Thanks." Philip set the bag down and leaned against the stall door, watching as Will trotted in circles around Grace. "They're something special, aren't they?" "They are," Charlotte said softly. She glanced at Philip, her voice wavering. "Thank you for helping out." He shrugged. "Least I can do after the mess I caused." "It wasn't your fault," she said, though the memory of her confrontation with him still stung. "I jumped to conclusions. I'm sorry." Philip waved her apology away. "You had every right to be upset. If I'd been in your shoes, I'd have done the same." They worked in companionable silence for a while, and the tension between them easing. Philip's presence became a regular occurrence, and his support felt like a lifeline during the loneliest moments. Despite the progress in the barn, the weight of Charles's betrayal lingered. Late at night, Charlotte would sit at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from her. She hated him for what he'd done, but she couldn't deny the years they'd spent building the farm together. When Matthew asked if she missed him, she hesitated before answering. "I don't know," she admitted. "I miss the man I thought he was. But the man who did this, I don't know if I can forgive him." Her son nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe he didn't mean to hurt us, Mom. People make mistakes." Charlotte sighed, her heart heavy. "Mistakes are one thing, Matthew. But trust is everything. Once it's broken, it's hard to put back together." In the quiet moments, Charlotte began to dream of a new purpose for the farm. Watching Will and Grace thrive, she realized the potential their story held. "We could turn this place into something bigger," she said one evening, sketching plans on a notepad. "A sanctuary for animals, maybe. A place where people can learn about care and resilience." Matthew leaned over her shoulder, nodding. "That sounds amazing, Mom." "It won't be easy," she said, her voice tinged with both hope and trepidation. "But it feels right." The idea took hold quickly. Philip offered to help with the logistics, and Matthew threw himself into preparations. For the first time in months, Charlotte felt a flicker of excitement for the future. The scars Charles had left behind still hurt. But the farm, and the family she'd built around it, was stronger than ever. The sound of children's laughter echoed through the barn as Charlotte adjusted the strap on Will's halter. The once quiet and isolated Kastner farm now buzzed with activity. Families strolled along the newly painted fences, while others gathered near the paddock to watch Grace and Goldie graze under the mid-morning sun. "This way, folks," Charlotte called, leading a small group towards the stables. "We'll start with a quick demonstration on how to care for a horse's coat. Goldie here loves a good brushing." Goldie raised her head slightly, her ears flicking toward the crowd. She stood tall and calm, her presence commanding admiration. As Charlotte began brushing, she explained each motion, her voice steady and filled with pride. The children leaned in closer, wide-eyed with fascination. "That's Goldie?" a little boy asked, clutching his mother's hand. "The one who had twins?" Charlotte nodded with a smile. "That's right. She's the reason we're all here today. Her story is a reminder that love and perseverance can overcome even the toughest challenges." Inside the barn, Will and Grace had become instant stars. Will trotted confidently around the stall, his energy infectious, while Grace stood close by, still a bit shy but visibly stronger. Visitors couldn't get enough of their antics, snapping photos and marveling at their bond. Charlotte's heart swelled as she watched the foals interact with the guests. It was as if Goldie's legacy had ignited something new, a shared sense of hope among everyone who came to the farm. A week later, Charlotte received a letter in the mail. She hesitated before opening it, recognizing Charles's handwriting on the envelope. The note was simple but heartfelt. Charles apologized for his actions and the pain he'd caused, expressing his deep regret and hope for redemption. "If you'll have me back," he wrote, "I'll spend the rest of my life proving I've changed." Charlotte sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling in her hands. For days, she wrestled with the decision. Finally, she penned her response. "I'm willing to give you a chance, but only under one condition. You must show me, not just tell me, that you've changed." As word of Goldie's miraculous twins spread online, more visitors arrived at Kastner Farm. Videos of the foals' playful escapades and Goldie's calm, nurturing demeanor went viral, drawing attention from animal lovers and sponsors alike. "Your story is an inspiration," one guest told Charlotte, handing her a small donation. "It's a reminder that even in hard times, miracles can happen." Charlotte's chest tightened with gratitude. The farm, once on the brink of despair, now thrived as a symbol of resilience and love. By early morning, the farm was alive with activity. Strings of lights hung across the paddocks and colorful flags fluttered in the breeze. Long tables laden with homemade pies, roasted vegetables, and fresh apple cider lined the yard. Charlotte stood at the barn entrance, watching as guests poured in. She'd organized the festival to celebrate Goldie's strength and the survival of Will and Grace. The foals had already become local legends, but this was a chance to bring the community together. "Goldie looks like royalty," Philip joked as he carried a basket of apples to the feed table. "You've really outdone yourself, Charlotte." Charlotte smiled, adjusting her hat. "She deserves it. After everything she's been through, today's all about her and those two rascals." Will and Grace were the stars of the event. Guests gathered around their pen, watching as Will raced in circles, kicking up straw, while Grace followed with a newfound confidence. "Is this the same foal you said might not make it?" one visitor asked, marveling at Grace's playful antics. Charlotte nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "She's proof that even the smallest, weakest among us can grow into something extraordinary with enough care and love." As the day stretched into evening, the barn glowed with warm light. Guests lingered over desserts, sharing stories and laughter. Near the paddock, Charles stood quietly, helping a group of children feed apples to Goldie. Charlotte watched from a distance, her emotions conflicting. After months apart, this was the first time Charles had returned to the farm. His demeanor was subdued, his actions deliberate, as if every gesture was meant to prove his sincerity. When the festival began to wind down, Charles approached Charlotte, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He hesitated, then said, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but seeing what you've done here, it makes me realize how much I've taken for granted." Charlotte didn't respond immediately. Instead, she looked out at the barn, at the people, the lights, and the horses. "It's not about what you say, Charles," she said finally, her voice calm. "It's about what you do." He nodded, understanding. Months later, the Kastner farm had become more than just a home for animals. It was now a hub for education and community, offering workshops on horse care, resilience, and the power of second chances. Charlotte stood at the edge of the paddock, watching Will and Grace gallop across the field. Will had grown tall and strong, his movements graceful and sure. Grace, though smaller, had a sharp intelligence and a knack for connecting with visitors. Behind her, Charles and Matthew worked together to repair a section of the fence. The cracks in their family were slowly healing, mended by shared purpose and hard work. Charlotte felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The betrayals and hardships were still part of their story, but they no longer defined it. Instead, they had become stepping stones towards something greater. As the morning sun bathed the farm in golden light, Charlotte smiled. The future wasn't just bright, it was filled with endless possibilities. Together, they would make it shine. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking around till the end of this story. Wow, wasn't that an emotional roller coaster? Charlotte's journey in this tale isn't just about her love for her animals, it's about resilience, forgiveness, and the lengths we go to protect the things we cherish most. For me, what stood out most was Goldie's strength. She wasn't just a horse in this story, she symbolized courage and hope. Despite all odds, she gave life to two beautiful foals, and in doing so, she reminded us that even in the toughest moments, miracles can happen. But let's not forget Charlotte's struggle. Her determination to stand up for her family, both human and animal, shows us the power of love and trust. She made tough decisions, and through it all, she stayed true to her values. Even when betrayed by someone she trusted most, she chose to rebuild, not with anger, but with purpose. And that's a lesson we can all take to heart. This story also teaches us about forgiveness. Charles made mistakes, huge ones, but the way Charlotte handled it, with firm boundaries and, eventually, a willingness to give him a second chance, is something worth thinking about. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, it's about finding a way forward. Now, I want to hear from you. What lessons did you take away from this story? How do you think you'd handle the challenges Charlotte faced? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to discuss this with you. And if this story inspired you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a little hope today. See you in the next story.